Usually at these regional conferences, the swine field specialist always kind of puts what we call the tools for your toolbox portion. So just like to share a little bit of information, and particularly for Southeast Iowa, kind of want to just be able to share some information around manure foaming. Certainly, it's been a topic of the last few weeks in this region, and the dangers obviously associated with flash fires. So a lot of this work was put together by Dan Anderson. He is the manure guy at Iowa State, and he's overly enthusiastic about it, more so than I could ever be talking about manure. So he's got a great podcast that shares all this information that I would certainly recommend. It's called the Talking Crap Podcast, and so it's he goes into all things manure, both from a nutrient value standpoint as well as management and things of this, like what we'll talk about here today regarding foam. So, learning objectives, kind of outline a little bit. Obviously, define and give a little background on what manure foam is, the dangers associated with manure foaming, and then what we know and what we've learned over time. So, manure foam. Viscous, dark brown to gray in color. It's obviously solids rich liquid with entrapped bubbles in it. So in those bubbles, as we'll talk a little bit, obviously are make up, or a high percentage of the gas that makes up those bubbles is methane, and is the gas of concern when we're talking about flash fire scenarios. So dangers of foam and methane, obviously in a normal situation where we've got no foam and no agitation taking place, and we're not releasing any of the methane into the air, be representative of the top image there where we've got no foam in the barn. Of course, if that foam breaks and it reaches a threshold as far as parts per million in the air, obviously puts that farm at a risk scenario for a flash fire in the case where we would have a large release of methane then. So a question that I will then obviously get often, a lot of times in the fall when pits are at their fullest, but a lot of times you'll get calls from producers and say, I've got a foam issue. What are my options? What can I do? And truthfully, I don't know if there's any really proven ways to prevent manure foam. We know how to treat the symptoms. And I would say there's ones that maybe treat the symptoms as far as addressing the actual foam issue. And we've got other ones that maybe try to better address maybe the root cause and the bacteria, the bacteria and the microbiology of the pit itself. But obviously, if it's an option, not always the case. Being able to remove some of the manure to be able to increase head space if that foam is rising up, approaching the slats. Obviously, it's not always the case, right? I've gotten calls in late July before with concerns about pit foam, or in cases like what we've had in the last couple weeks where maybe it's not always conducive to be able to remove any manure or haul any out because you don't have anywhere to go with it. But certainly that is something that can be considered if you have that option, or that if that's a possibility. Sprinkle the foam with water. In parentheses, used with caution, right? For obvious reasons, as soon as you start to be able to sprinkle that foam with water, you're going to be breaking those bubbles and releasing methane and increasing the percentage of methane in the airspace then, and potentially increasing your risk then of a flash fire in that scenario. So anti-foaming agents, certainly I would say in large part, a lot of those are just going to be a different type of a surfactant, okay? So a lot of those surfactants, think like any type of a crop oil, all it really does is changes the surface tension of those bubbles in the foam. So then ultimately they kind of suppress themselves. There is some components, I mentioned crop oil specifically. We talk about it in our manure management meetings. If you're going to use something like a crop oil, a soybean oil, or something to be able to reduce foam, you're going to have to haul the manure out relatively quickly as well, because what happens is that oil can break down over time and actually ends up being an energy source for the bacteria. Then you actually make your foam problem worse. So in the short term, if you add crop oil or something, particularly if you've got a foam issue in the fall, be prepared to be able to haul your manure relatively soon, right? And there's other products available. I can't speak to any of them specifically. I know there's anti-foaming agents you can buy at local retailers and so forth, that I think their components maybe don't break down quite as fast as crop oil, so you do have a little bit of a time from that standpoint. But again, those are more or less addressing, in most cases, addressing sort of the surface tension aspect of the foam, so it doesn't, as soon as those gases rise up out of the pit, they don't actually form bubbles and form foam. Another one, I would say a common one that then, at least I recommend, because I think it addresses more of the root cause. And again, it's certainly not a preventative, but is through the use of antimicrobials, specifically ionophores that we'll address here in a little bit and kind of how those work. But if you've ever heard someone recommend like a Rumensin or a Skysis or something, those are antimicrobials that we're trying to address the methanogens that are in the pit that are actually producing the methane to be able to reduce the overall gas production from the pit is ultimately what we're trying to do. And certainly if you've got foam, try to find ways to eliminate any sorts of sparks or ignitions, right? So any type of old switches or anything that may short out, maybe you see a spark every once in a while, probably something needs fixed. Reviewing motors. Certainly, I mean, if we want to speak locally, welding in the barn, certainly if you're going to do any type of welding, one, make sure that there's no foam before doing so. But then also I would say putting down a slag mat below where you're welding, not just letting the sparks and slag fall into the pit. Certainly that we can speak of instances that have happened locally that were a cause of that, right? So it goes for welding, grinding, any type of metal work in the barn there. So again, precautions when treating foam, as we just said, obviously if you're going to go through, whether it's the barn's empty and you've got foam, or running a sprinkler system, or people going in power wash, certainly if there's any instance where the foam is going to be, where it's going to break and you're going to release methane, one, need to make sure any ignition switches are off, including pilot lights, welding, and so forth. Really shutting off all the breakers except for maybe except for the fans that are going to allow for ventilation and exhausting those gases out. Is certainly going to be the recommendation, just to eliminate or reduce the number of opportunity for spark or ignition to occur. Obviously vacating the barn and then keeping that ventilation rate at roughly 30 CFM per pig space. And we'll show that here with this one, just as far as the ventilation time and dilution. So this is looking at, I believe this graph here is working off of a 2480, so standard 2480 hog barn here. And so looking at 90,000 CFM divided by 2480 is roughly going to be around that 35 CFMs per pig space. And you can see within about 2 to 3 minutes, we can at least get it down to a threshold where we're at least below that parts per million or that flash fire concern. So certainly if you're going to go through and we're going to try to break any of the foam up, whether it's through power washing, run a sprinkler system, being able to obviously have that ventilation running at a minimum or fast enough rate, you can actually, as you break it, you can exhaust a lot of those gases out as well. So some of these slides are going to get a little bit more into the structure of the foam. And myself not being a manure biologist, I won't dive into too much detail on it. But from the standpoint of what ultimately makes up foam is obviously you have the gas in general, that the biogas, in this case methane being the one of concern, and there is other gases that would certainly make up foam, whether it's hydrogen sulfide, CO2 potentially, right? So all ones that would be concerned, but from a flammability standpoint, methane is the one certainly with the greatest concern. The surfactant itself, and really it's just the components that change the surface tension of that of the foam in that bubble itself. So when I say you add a type of surfactant like a crop oil, as was mentioned, it's changing that surface tension up to where that foam can actually form in that instance. And then stabilizers, thinking about all the different structures and small fibers and particles that would be in a pit that would ultimately help really kind of create the structure within the manure foam itself. So kind of what do we hypothesize, right? So in general, I think there's two schools of thought particularly in the last, ever since, really since the ethanol boom, right? Two schools of thought that have really changed or thought to change and go along with the sort of the manure foaming phenomenon and issues that we've had in the industry, right? So one is microbial, and evolution's inevitable. And small changes in selective pressure with different microbial populations can cause big differences, right? That's certainly a plausible thought there. But also, since the ethanol industry has come on, we've also increasingly fed DDGs. Now, I don't think maybe DDGs are the sole reason for why we have manure foam, but potentially a contributor, feeding obviously greater sulfur concentrations, but also increasing the amount of fiber in the diet as well. And we do know that higher fiber diets are lead to greater carbon excretion in manure, and carbon being a fundamental piece, obviously, of methane. So if we're excreting more carbon into the manure, it's possible that's also a contributing factor from that standpoint. Higher methane production rate in foaming manures. So, and I'll show a little bit of that information here a little bit, but we know if the manure is foaming, they're also producing more methane in the process as well. And then just kind of goes into the foam as an emulsion. We'll talk a little bit about that. But really it's an emulsion of proteins, kind of like as Dan Anderson says, kind of like a meringue, right? It's kind of that similar type structure. Okay, so looking at just kind of the study of the biogas phase and kind of what ultimately makes up manure foam. So I think this is kind of a good, I would say, summary slide, if you will, when we think about methane production. Is barns with foam consistently also have higher methane production. Now you wouldn't think, you would think maybe that is kind of stating the obvious from that standpoint. But if they have foam, it's also suggesting that there's more bacteria that are also producing that methane and ultimately resulting in that foam. So not only does foam capture methane, but there's also more methane. Also, when we think about the manure, or the methane production rate versus the amount of the total solids in a pit. Okay, so typically I would say dry matter of manure, is going to be somewhere around probably 5 to 6%. But we've also, as an industry, have been very conscious of our water usage and not trying to not waste as much water, right? So I would say it's certainly not uncommon for manures to probably float anywhere between that 5 to 8% dry matter, which is also kind of the sweet spot when we look at overall methane production too. We could certainly water down our manure and we reduce the amount of methane that it's going to produce, but then we're also paying more to haul that manure out because we're not hauling out nutrients, we're hauling out excess water in the process. We can also increase that dry matter, but then again, it's really hard to be that conservative from that standpoint, trying to increase that dry matter. And it also creates logistical issues as far as hauling manure that's obviously that dense as well. It's not as easy on equipment. So some challenges from that standpoint, but we do know that there is kind of a sweet spot where kind of probably in that 5 to 8% total solids concentration also happens to be the sweet spot for manure or methane production as well. So these next couple slides, they kind of go over a little bit more of the, I would say, the long chain fatty acids and the structure of that foam from that standpoint, and the viscosity. One thing that I'll just point out when we talk about this is looking at the foam from the manure versus just the manure from a foaming pit versus non-foaming manure. You can see that the foam itself, as is, has a lot higher viscosity level than, say, everything else. So there is something else that's giving that foam that structure. What that is, I don't know if we actually know that, whether it's sugars or carbohydrates, oil in the pit itself, protein excretion from the pig. I don't know if we know exactly what all goes into it, but it's you can clearly see here the foam itself has a little bit different properties compared to just a manure from a foaming pit versus a non-foaming pit. Okay. Next, bring it to just kind of the microbial analysis. So some of the work that's been done is trying to figure, okay, what's the root cause? Why do we have pits? You can have barns on the same site, and you can have one barn that has a pit that has foam in it and one that doesn't. And ultimately what it boils down to is there's a different microbial populations in each pit, right? And it becomes down, how do we manage those microbes that are in that pit to be able to make sure we're mitigating any type of a foaming issue. So when we look at it from the overarching data analysis standpoint and trying to figure out what was correlated with pits that foamed, the ones that came with the strongest correlation was temperature, obviously the depth of the pit. So obviously the more manure in the pit, more potential for foam and foam production, overall methane production, and then like I said, temperature. Some correlation there with fiber, as we said, with DDGs. Probably as it drove methane over time, as we continue to feed that and potentially change the microbial population from that standpoint. I think this is kind of a good representative slide, and obviously it won't go into any of the specific microbial families and classifications there across the bottom, but I think it kind of goes to show just how diverse, how different and diverse those microbial populations actually are when we look at a non-foaming pit versus a foaming pit. And really it's kind of two two different pictures from that standpoint as far as what type of microbes are making up the pits in either scenario, right? So this is where I bring everything, I guess, kind of full circle when we talk about, okay, so if I get a call from a producer and they want to know they've got a foaming issue, what can they do? The best recommendation I can give at this point, and there's lots of folks that maybe have different opinions, but is to use some type of an ionophore. And obviously ionophores, I look at this way. So ionophores are an antimicrobial commonly fed in livestock diets, specifically fed in many beef, bovine diets, and beef specifically, right? And it's because it acts as an antimicrobial in the gut and ultimately can improve average daily gain performance. But also inadvertently, I think of it from a ruminant standpoint, it also it can help suppress bloat. Bloat is often caused by overproduction of methane, right? So I kind of always think of it this way: is if using an ionophore maybe in the pit, we can change some of those that microbial population in the pit, and that's ultimately what it does. Is you're more so, instead of addressing the foam issue itself, you're trying to address the source of the foam. And so in general, if I get a call, say in midsummer in July, using an ionophore in some fashion to be able to address the foam can get you probably about 90 days, as you can see here, where we look at just overall methane production versus those blue bars across the top was your control of non-treated pit, and then I believe the other ones is all different levels, but we look at ionophores, specifically this one's Narracin, so it'd be like Schisis would be the common trade name we hear. Also Rumensin, it would be the one that's fed through beef. Coban is what would be fed to poultry, but all should have similar effects as far as being able to impact that microbial population and reduce the amount of methane production. And you can see over time it does gradually. We get out to 4 to 5 months after treatment, it does gradually start to incline. So a lot of times, maybe a recommendation from that standpoint is if you're going to treat it maybe midsummer, whenever you get that pit pumped out, get it as pumped out as much as possible, get the pit level as low as possible, and then treat again. Because through pumping, you've already removed a lot of the microbial population itself, and you stand a better chance to maybe impact or change that microbial population when it's at its all-time low, and then we're adding an ionophore in that instance. And the general recommendation that I always give to producers, and it's one that is published on lots of Iowa State's resources, is 5 pounds per 100,000 gallons of liquid manure. And the importance isn't just going through and sprinkling, because if you just go through and sprinkle it on the crust or the top layer, its efficacy is going to be reduced because it's not physically getting into the pit. So visiting with Dr. Dan Anderson, typically what he's always recommended to me and what I always pass along to producers from that standpoint, then take it, mix it up in a 5-gallon bucket and physically try to get it below the crust and actually incorporate it into the pit. And it'll self-disperse on itself throughout the pit after that. But just putting it on top of the foam or putting it on any type of a crust level won't incorporate it fully enough to actually be as effective at impacting that microbial population. So it's a matter of actually getting it down into the surface to get it incorporated is what helps it. So, and I visit with producers who I've made this recommendation to, because a lot of times they call, you give them the recommendation, then you don't hear anything from them. So I have followed up with a few of them, and the general thought is it takes about 3 to 4 days, but that foam eventually regresses, and it does at least buys them some time for that from that standpoint. So at least maybe until they can hopefully get it hauled out. So with that, I'll kind of open it for questions and comments if you've got any, but I will just go ahead and flip through maybe obviously some good pictures that Dan has as far as what might be seen, right? And so certainly in this instance, you wouldn't, the last thing you would want to do if you had actually had a fire in the pit, okay, in that case, that fire is probably just burning across the top. And what you don't want to do is take a hose and start spraying it, because then you're just going to break the foam and release more methane in the process and potentially make a bigger fire. In most cases, the fire department's going to come out. It's actually going to be kind of a fog is how they would address that, because it's going to be the particle size can kind of more or less suppress the foam and kind of blanket it versus actually popping the bubbles. So, and of course, situations like that. Yeah, so that's what I've got. Any questions? If not,
Speeds, guys, help reduce into the thin.
so that's one thing that I don't know if anyone's ever really looked at it, because I don't think anyone's ever looked at, to my knowledge, the difference in microbial population in a barn that's fed schisis versus one that's not, right? You'd like to think that maybe the schisis is doing more of its job in the gut of the pig and maybe not as impactful. I mean, because that's ultimately what you're putting it in for, is to impact feed conversion and average daily gain and growth of the pig. So you like to think maybe it's having its impact in the gut, and and maybe its usefulness is used up there versus rather than in the pit. I would say in conversations I've had with producers, they feed schisis, they still have a foam issue. Now, how it changes its efficacy as a potential treatment, that's one thing that I've asked other veterinarians and even Rodemaker too, as far as, is there any concern from a antimicrobial resistance to it? And as far as we know, as of right now, there's not, right? But I would assume the pass-through rate of schisis in the gut is probably lessened versus just adding it straight to the pit. You know what I mean? That's my unscientific interpretation of how it would work, but my theory is its usefulness as far as an antimicrobial might be exhausted in the pig's gut and not be as effective as preventing foam. So, of course, that's going to be live recorded on YouTube. So, but
does anybody know here department they put the handle with it like a fire with a hog or something?
yeah, no, I don't know. Andy's the fire chief for Washington, so he would be the guy to ask. I would think like Washington probably is. Kyoto, I mean, I would imagine a lot of the fire departments with lots of hog barns probably are, but I would imagine you get outside of maybe Washington and Keokuk County. But yeah, no, like last fall we actually had a livestock truck rollover training for all of our QRS and fire departments and quick responders, and this was a piece we covered with them too. In addition to that, was what's the what are some considerations you show up to a site with a barn fire and so forth. So, if nothing else, thanks everybody for coming.